This teaching is about Alzheimer's disease, and this subject is very near to my heart because I have a personal experience with my grandmother. She lived with Alzheimer's from her late 80s until her death at age 98, so I witnessed her progression through all of the stages until the day of her death. So let's learn about Alzheimer's together. In this Module 1, we have several course objectives. We're going to go over the definition, how the brain works and how Alzheimer's affects the brain, how memory loss and other related disorders differs from normal aging, other neurological diseases or conditions that can cause irreversible dementia, conditions or disorders that may result in symptoms that mimic Alzheimer's, how it is diagnosed, causes, cures, and research overview. Alzheimer's disease is named after a Dr. Alois Alzheimer. In 1906, this Dr. Alzheimer noticed changes in the brain tissue of a woman who had died of an unusual mental illness. Her symptoms included memory loss, language problems, and unpredictable behavior. After she died, he examined her brain and he found many abnormal clumps and tangled bundles of fiber. We now know that those are called amyloid plaques, and they're also called tau tangles. Now, these plaques and tangles in the brain are still considered some of the main features of the disease. And another feature is the loss of connections between nerve cells in the brain. Alzheimer's disease is an irreversible, progressive brain disorder that slowly destroys memory and thinking skills, and eventually the ability to carry out the simplest tasks. In most people with Alzheimer's, symptoms appear in their mid-60s. Experts suggest that more than 5.8 million Americans, most of them age 65 or older, may have dementia caused by Alzheimer's. And by 2050, this number could reach 14 million. It is currently ranked as the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, and every 65 seconds, someone develops the disease. It kills more people than breast and prostate cancer combined. Now, Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia among older adults, and we'll discuss the other types later. It accounts for 50 to 80% of dementia cases. Now, dementia, as a general term, is defined by the loss of cognitive functioning, thinking, remembering, and reasoning, and behavioral abilities to such an extent that it interferes with a person's daily life and activities. It is important to remember that dementia is the umbrella term, and then there's different types of dementia, of which Alzheimer's is the most common. And unfortunately, it has no current cure, but treatments for symptoms are available, and of course, the research continues. Current treatments also cannot stop Alzheimer's from progressing, but they can temporarily slow the worsening of dementia symptoms and improve the quality of life for those with Alzheimer's and their caregivers. On average, a person with Alzheimer's lives about 4 to 8 years after diagnosis, but can live as long as 20 years, and of course, this depends on many different factors. How does Alzheimer's disease affect the brain? Changes in the brain may begin a decade or more before memory and other cognitive problems appear. Now, during this preclinical stage of Alzheimer's disease, people seem to be symptom-free, but what's really going on is their toxic changes are taking place in the brain. These abnormal deposits of proteins form amyloid plaques and tau tangles throughout the brain, and these once healthy neurons stop functioning and lose connections with other neurons and die. Of course, many other complex brain changes are thought to play a role in Alzheimer's too. The damage initially appears to take place in the hippocampus and the cortex, which are those are parts of the brain very essential for forming memories. And as more neurons die, additional parts of the brain are affected, and begin to shrink. And by the final stage of Alzheimer's, the damage is widespread and the brain tissue has shrunk significantly. And you can see the picture here, the comparison between a healthy brain and somebody with severe Alzheimer's. We're going to watch a video, and it will give us a little bit information about what happens to the brain in Alzheimer's disease.
In healthy people, all sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, and feelings are the result of signals that pass through billions of nerve cells or neurons in the brain. Neurons constantly communicate with each other through electrical charges that travel down axons, causing the release of chemicals across tiny gaps to neighboring neurons. Other cells in the brain, such as astrocytes and microglia, clear away debris and help keep neurons healthy. In a person with Alzheimer's disease, the most basic form of dementia, toxic changes in the brain destroy this healthy balance. These changes may occur years, even decades, before the first signs of dementia. Researchers believe that this process involves two proteins, called beta amyloid and tau, which somehow become toxic to the brain. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates, eventually forming tangles inside neurons. And beta amyloid clumps into plaques, which slowly build up between neurons. As the level of amyloid reaches a tipping point, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. But tau and beta amyloid may not be the only factors involved in Alzheimer's. Other changes that affect the brain may also play a role over time. The vascular system may fail to deliver sufficient blood and nutrients to the brain. The brain may lack the glucose needed to power its activity. Chronic inflammation sets in as microglial cells fail to clear away debris, and astrocytes react to distressed microglia. Eventually, neurons lose their ability to communicate. As neurons die, the brain shrinks, beginning in the hippocampus, a part of the brain important to learning and memory. People may begin to experience memory loss, impaired decision-making, and language problems. As more neurons die throughout the brain, a person with Alzheimer's gradually loses the ability to think, remember, make decisions, and function independently. Achieving a deeper understanding of the molecular and cellular mechanisms and how they may interact is vital to the development of effective therapies. Much progress has been made in identifying various underlying factors. Advances in brain imaging allow us to see the course of plaques and tangles in the living brain. Blood and fluid biomarkers are providing insights about when the disease starts and how it progresses. More is also known about the genetic underpinnings of the disease and how they can affect particular biological pathways. These advances enable the development and testing of promising new therapies, including drugs that reduce or clear the increase of tau and amyloid proteins in the brain, therapies targeting the vascular system, glucose metabolism, and inflammation, and lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet, and behavioral approaches like social engagement that may enhance brain health. Research is moving quickly, ever closer to the day when we can delay or even prevent the devastation of dementia.
It's also important to go over the normal effects of aging on the brain versus dementia. I've spoken to many people that are worried about their memory problems or their short-term memory problems, and they're afraid they have dementia, but there's a big difference between the two. So let's look at this. Normal aging is simply not being able to remember details of a conversation or an event that took place a year ago. Oh my goodness, I'm in my 40s and that happens to me right now. With dementia, people can't even recall details of recent events or even conversations. Normal aging would be not being able to remember the name of an acquaintance. Again, I'm in my 40s and I have this problem. In dementia, it's not recognizing or knowing the names of family members. In normal aging, people can forget things and events occasionally, but in dementia, forgetting things or events is very frequent. In normal aging, we can have occasional problems or difficulties finding words, but in dementia, there's frequent pauses and substitutions when finding words. In normal aging, we're worried about our memory, but your relatives are not. But in dementia, it's usually the family that notice those first changes. The relatives are worried about their memory, but you yourself or the person with dementia is not aware of any problems. Now, there are many other types of dementia, which we're going to talk about a little bit. Vascular dementia is a decline in thinking skills, but that is caused by conditions that block or reduce blood flow to various regions of the brain. That means that those regions of the brain are deprived of oxygen and nutrients. An example would be diabetes that can cause microvascular changes to the brain that can lead to memory problems and dementia. Another type is Lewy body dementia. That's a type of progressive dementia that leads to a decline in thinking, reasoning, and independent function because of abnormal microscopic deposits that damage brain cells over time. Now, this was the type of dementia that was found in Robert Williams when they did his autopsy, if you remember that. Another type of dementia is frontotemporal dementia, or degenerations, and this refers to a group of disorders caused by progressive nerve cell loss in the brain's frontal lobe. So that would be the areas behind your forehead, or its temporal lobes, which are the regions behind the ears. Parkinson's disease can also cause dementia, and there is a decline in thinking and reasoning that develops in many people with Parkinson's at least a year after their diagnosis. And mixed dementia is a condition in which brain changes of more than one cause of dementia occur simultaneously. So one of the things that I do want to talk about today is the prevalence of psychosis across dementia types. So when we think in reality that at least 5.8 million adults in the U.S. are affected by dementia, you can see the different percentages of actual psychosis. And I'll talk about the symptoms of that a little bit later. Now, in Alzheimer's disease, about 30% of people can develop this. In vascular dementia, you can see it's about 15%. Now, if we talk about dementia with Lewy bodies, which again is what Robin Williams had, 75% of those patients can have psychosis. And in Parkinson's disease, it's actually higher than Alzheimer's, which is 50%. And in frontotemporal dementia, it's only 10%. There's a lot of challenges in identifying and treating psychosis in patients with dementia. And in a lot of patients, there's already agitation, there can be aggression. But psychosis is defined by hallucinations, delusions, and formal thought disorder. And what formal thought disorder is, it's incoherent discourse. So they're talking and you can't understand anything they say. Abnormal motor behavior and negative symptoms. So blunted affect, poverty of speech, apathy. Let's go over the psychotic symptoms. Now, a lot of people can have hallucinations, and what hallucinations are perceptions experienced without an external stimulus. So they're sensory in nature. So they can be visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, gustatory, so which would be by taste, and multimodal, so different types or a combination of different types. And delusions are false fixed beliefs despite evidence to the contrary. So there can be paranoia, There can be delusions. They can become grandiose or somatic or self-blaming and hopeless. And we'll talk about managing those at a little later time. Now, there's also related conditions that can actually mimic Alzheimer's. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is one of those. It's a brain condition associated with repeated blows to the head. This is what they're talking about. This is what happens to football players, professional football players, if throughout their career they've had repeated blows to the head. And it's also associated with the development of dementia. So potential signs of this are thinking and memory problems, personality changes, and behavioral changes, including aggression and depression. People may not experience these signs until years or decades after these brain injuries occur. And a definitive diagnosis, however, can only be made after death on an autopsy. There is also mild cognitive impairment. This causes a slight but not noticeable and measurable decline in cognitive abilities. So this includes memory and thinking skills. And a person with mild cognitive impairment is increased risk of developing Alzheimer's or another type of dementia, but it doesn't always mean that it is that. Also, traumatic brain injuries results from an impact to the head that disrupts normal brain function. Traumatic brain injury may affect a person's cognitive abilities and also their learning and thinking skills. And there's lots of other conditions that really should be ruled out before dementia is diagnosed. This would be, depression and anxiety and mental health issues, infections, even thyroid disease, vitamin deficiencies, including vitamin B12. It can even be caused by Lyme disease or different types of medications, especially in the elderly, because sometimes if people are removed from all those multiple medications, they'll actually do better after that. Also, vestibular orders can be confused. And of course, migraine disease. And what people don't realize about migraine is it's much more than just a headache. It's a whole neurological disorder that is especially accompanied by something that people call brain fog. And that would be mild cognitive impairment while they're having the attacks and even between attacks. So how is Alzheimer's disease diagnosed? Well, diagnosis of Alzheimer's and other types of dementia is based basically on symptoms. There's no one test or technique that can diagnose it. So always a healthcare provider should ask the person and the family member or the friend questions about the person's overall health, their use of prescription and over-the-counter medications, their diet, their past medical problems, their ability to carry out activities, and changes in behavior and personality. There's also lots of memory tests that can be done. So tests that also involve problem solving, attention, counting, language. The easiest is something called the clock drawing test. And if somebody fails that, they would go on to something called the mini mental status examination or the Alzheimer's disease assessment scale. And there's different types too. These are just the most commonly used. Also, standard medical tests should be carried out, such as blood tests and urine tests to identify if there's any other causes of the problem. And a lot of healthcare providers will do brain scans, such as a CT or an MRI or even a PET scan to rule out other possible causes. Now, these scans are also used, of course, they're mainly used to rule out other conditions, and they're usually normal in early disease, but they can compare this later on in the disease if they need to. So there will be certain brain abnormalities in, of course, the later stages of Alzheimer's. So these tests, again, may be repeated to give doctors information about how the person's memory and other cognitive functions are changing over time. What causes Alzheimer's disease? Well, unfortunately, scientists don't yet fully understand what causes Alzheimer's in most people. Now, in people with early onset Alzheimer's, so that would be much younger than that 65, that general 65 years of age, a genetic mutation may be the cause. But late onset Alzheimer's arises from a complex series of brain changes that can occur over decades, and it's probably a combination of genetic environmental, and lifestyle factors. The importance of any one of these factors in increasing or decreasing the risk of developing Alzheimer's may also differ from person to person. It's important to understand, and if you want to, you can say it with me 5 times. Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging, but the greatest known risk factor is aging. And again, the majority of people with Alzheimer's are 65 and older. But it's not necessarily just a disease of old age, because approximately 200,000 Americans under the age of 65 have younger onset Alzheimer's disease, or it's also known as early onset Alzheimer's. Research suggests that a host of factors, even beyond genetics, may play a role in the development and the course of Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of interest, for example, in the relationship between cognitive decline and vascular conditions such as heart disease, stroke, and high blood pressure, as well as other metabolic conditions like diabetes and obesity. But ongoing research will help us understand whether and how reducing risk factors for these conditions may also reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. A nutritious diet, physical activity, social engagement, sleep, and mentally stimulating pursuits have all been associated with helping people stay healthy as they age. And of course, these factors might also help reduce the risk of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. And clinical trials are currently being done to test some of these possibilities. Early life factors may also play a role. For example, studies have linked higher levels of education with a decreased risk of dementia. And there's also differences in racial groups and sexes, all of which are being studied because we want a better understanding of the causes of Alzheimer's disease and, of course, to develop more effective treatments and prevention for all people. I think we're all waiting for the day when we finally find a cure for this disease. In the meantime, Alzheimer's is at the forefront of biomedical research. Researchers are working to uncover as many aspects of Alzheimer's and other dementias as possible. And some of the most remarkable progress has shed light on how Alzheimer's affects the brain. The hope is this better understanding will lead to new treatments, and many potential approaches are currently under investigation worldwide. Thank you for joining me in Module 1 of our Alzheimer's teaching.